Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you're having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. For as long as I can remember, my family has owned a small farm just outside of town. My grandparents started it years ago, and my parents took it over once they got married. I grew up wandering the fields, feeding the animals, and helping out with chores. Some of my best childhood memories were made on that little farm. So when my parents decided to retire and move south, they handed the farm over to me. I was thrilled to take on the legacy and raise my own kids there one day. The first few years were great. I upgraded some of the old equipment, rotated crops to keep the soil healthy, and even started selling produce at the local farmers market. Business was good and life was peaceful. That is, until my new neighbor moved in. The property next to ours had sat vacant for nearly a decade before this guy snapped it up. I'd hoped he might be a fellow farmer, or at least someone who appreciated the rural lifestyle. But I realized I was dead wrong the first time we spoke. It happened one morning as I was repairing a section of fence along our property line. A shiny black pickup truck pulled up, and out stepped the new neighbor. He sauntered over and introduced himself as Chad. Just from his white tennis outfit and expensive watch, I could tell this guy wasn't cut out for farm life. "So," he said, scanning my land, "you gonna sell me a chunk of this unused field or what?" I blinked in surprise. "Excuse me, this land isn't for sale." "Oh, come on, you've got plenty of space," he scoffed. "Name your price." I stood firm. "It's not about the space. This farm has been in my family for generations and it's all in use one way or another." Chad snorted. "Doesn't look that way to me, but suit yourself." He turned and headed back to his truck without another word. I hoped that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing Chad frequently standing at the property line, eyeing up my land. He even started walking onto it a bit, despite the no trespassing signs I posted. My requests for him to stay off my property were always met with an eye roll or middle finger. One day I came back from selling produce at the market to a horrifying sight. Half my south field was just gone, bulldozed away into a giant pit. Heavy machinery sat on the torn-up ground, continuing to dig. I saw Chad overseeing the work crew and rushed over, yelling for them to stop. He held up a hand. "Don't worry, we're almost done. Just had to clear away this unused land for my new pool." My mouth fell open. "Are you insane? This is my property. You can't just bulldoze it without permission." "Didn't need permission for an abandoned field," he shrugged. "Finders keepers, right?" I was practically shaking with anger. Not only had he destroyed a huge section of my farm, he claimed I had abandoned it. I told him in no uncertain terms to get his equipment off my property immediately. He just laughed. "Yeah, that's not happening. I've got permits approved and contractors booked. The pool is getting built, so you better get over it." That was the final straw. I whipped out my phone and dialed cops, requesting immediate police presence before this maniac did any more damage. Within 20 minutes, 2 police cars came flying down the road along with a county surveyor. I showed the officers my deed, proving the bulldozed land belonged to me. Meanwhile, the surveyor got to work staking out and confirming the legal property lines. Chad's smug attitude melted away real quick once he realized he was busted, but he still tried pleading ignorance, claiming he was allowed to build there. "This field has just been sitting here unused for ages," he argued. "I thought the owners clearly abandoned it long ago." One officer shut him down real quick. "That's not how property ownership works, sir. You can't just take land because you think it's abandoned." The surveyor confirmed that the pool construction was well over the line onto my farm. Chad had zero legal right to build anything there. In the end, the police made him halt construction immediately and remove all the equipment. He got slapped with a big fine for illegal land use and destruction of my property. And me? I sued his ass into the ground. I got a lawyer and filed a lawsuit for trespassing, illegal destruction of land, and any other charges we could pin on him. I gathered evidence like the no trespassing signs he ignored, and any documentation showing my continued use of the land. In court, Chad tried to stick to his lame defense that the land seemed abandoned. But the judge wasn't buying it. Especially once my lawyer presented county records showing regular tax payments on the full parcel for decades, proving it was very much still owned and in use. Long story short, Chad got reamed by the judge and ended up owing me over $100,000 in damages. He never got to build his precious pool either. His little construction project ended up costing him big time. As for me, I took great satisfaction in using some of that money to hire equipment which pushed the pile of demolished dirt right back into the crater on Chad's property. He came home to find his plans for a pool filled with the rubble from my field. Sweet, sweet revenge. In the end, I succeeded in restoring my farm to its original layout. It took time and money to repair the damage, but seeing my full fields back in working order made it worthwhile. The lesson here is clear. You can't just take someone else's land because you think it's abandoned. Property rights exist for a reason, and I'll be damned if I let some entitled jerk steal mine. Chad found that out the hard way. The next one is a pro-revenge story. Since I'm still in school, I took a job at a bakery, which I won't name. The place has bread in the name, but also sells overpriced salads and sandwiches. I worked there for close to a year, during which I had a boss named Betty, not her real name, of course. Betty and I didn't get along at all. She had caused the previous general manager to quit because she had an affair with him, and threatened to tell his wife if he didn't leave. He left the job quickly, and she was promoted to his position. I didn't like her, but I had to respect her dedication to becoming the general manager of such a small store. When I first started working there, I was respectful, but she would do things that irritated me. For instance, I would clean all the areas I was assigned to. And once I was done and relaxed for maybe 5 minutes, she would burst out of the manager's office, demanding, "Why aren't you working?" I would explain that I had completed my tasks, and as a cashier, if no customers were present, I didn't have anything to do. She would glare at me, and then I would see her accidentally spill an entire pot of brewed coffee onto my freshly mopped floor. So I learned to always appear busy. Once she realized I wasn't going to idolize her, she began reducing my hours. The store operated on a Game of Thrones-like politics for promotions and raises. Somehow, all her friends became managers and would bully the rest of us. She was rarely at work. She would drive to the job just to clock in case corporate decided to check her hours. So she was essentially stealing hours. When you clocked in, it printed out a small piece of paper indicating the time. She would drop these on the floor for me to clean up. I would usually pick them up and pocket them. This led to me discovering Betty's clock-in and clock-out stubs at my house. This detail becomes important later. Did I mention she was incredibly racist? She was white, and most of the staff were my fellow high school peers, who were mostly people of color. One day at work, she declared, "When you're on the clock, I own you." When we all reacted with shock, she tried to backtrack, saying, "I didn't mean it like that." This detail also becomes important later. After a while, I grew tired of practically begging for hours, so I found another job. However, I wanted to reduce my hours at the bakery, which were already minimal, but suddenly when I secured my new job, she scheduled me for every single day of an entire week. She had never done that, even when we were on somewhat good terms. I informed her of my new job and my inability to work that schedule. Later, I called a friend who still worked there to inform him that I planned to quit the next day. He has a habit of using speakerphone while cleaning at work, so Betty overheard. The next day I went in and respectfully began, "Thank you for the opportunity." Betty let me finish before saying, "Oh yeah, I meant to tell you, you're fired." I was so blindsided and angry that I lost my temper. My mother raised me to treat women with respect, but this woman infuriated me. She seemed to think overeating was a personality trait. I left, upset about being fired before I could resign, but I didn't dwell on it. I was only 18 and already had another job. I wasn't expecting a positive reference from Betty anyway. I would have moved on if it weren't for the district manager, Ben, not his real name, reaching out to me. He assumed I was still employed there, so I clarified that I had been fired. He was surprised, given that I had been a reliable employee. He inquired about the reason for my dismissal, and I explained the situation. He was upset that she had fired me before I could quit and asked if there were any other issues with her. I vented to him for a bit. When I mentioned her racist comment, he asked if anyone else could corroborate my story. I had forgotten to mention that she had gradually fired or forced many employees to quit, replacing them with her friends and family, which was against company policy due to potential conflicts of interest. Several co-workers agreed to back up my story. One coworker, Andy, who believed he was destined to be a famous vlogger, always had his phone out, recording audio or video. While his content was cringeworthy, he had labeled recordings by date and time. Upon checking, he found recordings of Betty making racist remarks. With the help of other former co-workers, we sifted through Andy's recordings and found several instances of Betty making controversial statements. For example, once a customer sneezed on the baked goods, and when a co-worker informed her, she laughed it off, saying no one would notice. But I wanted to do more. I avoid conflict, but when provoked, I see things through. I discovered on Facebook that she was married. No one knew this. So, when she had the affair with the previous manager and essentially blackmailed him, she was also being unfaithful to her husband. I don't think anyone cared enough to investigate because she wasn't pleasant. I found the previous manager, Mark, on Facebook, and learned that he and his wife had separated. Even after quitting, Betty had tried to extort money from him. When he refused, she informed his wife anyway, leading to their divorce and forcing him to move back with his parents. In my state, blackmail or extortion carries a third-degree penalty, which can result in up to 7 years in prison, and a fine exceeding $10,000 payable to the victim. I informed Mark of my plan, and he agreed to report her to the police, but he allowed me a week to finalize my part. I met with District Manager Ben and presented all our evidence, the recordings, written statements from other ex-co-workers, and the slips showing Betty's false clock-ins and clock-outs. Ben thanked me and began his investigation. A few days later, I noticed the store was closed during regular hours. A current employee informed me that Ben had verified through security footage that Betty wasn't working the hours she claimed. He also discovered she was embezzling from the store. She had violated numerous health and safety codes and used the repair funds for personal expenses. She was immediately fired, along with her allies, leaving the store understaffed. The store had to close temporarily for cleaning and repairs. Mark informed Betty's husband with photographic evidence of her affair, but he framed it as if it was ongoing. Betty's husband was furious and decided to divorce her. Betty, being the type to overshare on Facebook, pleaded for a place to stay, but her friends and family abandoned her. She ended up living in her car while job hunting. Mark then sued her for extortion. To make matters worse, the company sued her for the stolen funds and the costs of repairs and lost revenue during the store's closure. Betty's life unraveled. She had to sell her car at a significant loss to cover her legal expenses. Mark shared snippets of her emotional breakdowns in court with me. The next one is a petty revenge story. Some years ago, I worked at a gas station convenience store. It was a straightforward job with more sitting involved than actual work. I genuinely enjoyed the job because it felt balanced. The workload was light, and about 90% of the customers were pleasant, with some regulars that I adored. Occasionally, I encountered a difficult customer, but it was never too challenging or extreme. On the days I had a challenging customer, it was typically someone who believed that the price of gas and cigarettes was my fault. However, it wasn't something that kept me up at night. The hardest part of this job for me was the mental aspect. It was tough watching the same customers spend all their money on lottery tickets, exclaiming, "It only takes one," only to return the next day and repeat the process. Or witnessing the entitlement or lack of consideration from well-off individuals who couldn't be bothered to say hello, please, or thank you. I often tried to understand their mindset, but it was stressful trying to make sense of it all. Overall, it was a good starting job for me. I understand that others might feel differently, as I had friends in the same company who had more challenging experiences than I did. Now, let me share a story about a woman who came in to buy a soda. One day, I received a lot of $1 bills at my register, which was unusual as I typically got more $20 bills. We started with a limited amount of money in the register, and had signs up asking customers to pay with the smallest bill possible. We didn't keep many $20 bills on hand, depositing them into a safe once they accumulated. Any $50 or $100 bills were deposited right away. Once the money was in the safe, we couldn't access it. There were days when I had to refuse service to customers who only had $100 bills, as it would leave me short on change. One day, a woman and her friend entered the store. The woman wanted a fountain drink and began filling her cup. She filled it a little, took a sip, and repeated this process multiple times for about 5 minutes. I wanted to intervene, but the store owners prioritized customer retention over doing the right thing. So I watched in annoyance as she consumed nearly 2 refills worth of soda. She finally approached the counter to pay. Her total was $1.49. She opened her wallet, shuffled past several $1 and $5 bills, and chose to pay with a $50 bill. This irritated me due to her inconsideration. As she waited for her change, her friend stood by her side. In that moment, I decided to be a bit petty. I gave her $48.51 in change, all in ones and pennies. She looked surprised, and before she could react, I wished her a pleasant day. She left with her friend, and I continued my shift, feeling a small sense of victory. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I work at an auto manufacturer. In a previous job, I was responsible for making hoods for two styles of cars, which we'll refer to as A and B. I had worked in this position longer than anyone else on the team and knew exactly how to keep things running smoothly. The process involved placing parts in a machine, pressing a button, then placing more parts in another machine, and pressing another button. This cycle would continue indefinitely. One peculiar aspect of the robots was that they didn't function well when working on both A and B simultaneously. Therefore, if there was a need to switch between the two, all in-process parts had to be completed before starting new ones. Each rack could hold 8 hoods, so it was essential to finish one rack before switching. The system wasn't designed to handle partial racks. Typically, the person working would decide when to switch, and it was relatively easy to predict the frequency of these switches. Most of the management was fine with this arrangement, as long as the production line kept moving. Enter Wayne. Wayne was promoted from the line to a per diem position, which meant he received a slight pay increase. This promotion didn't sit well with the rest of us union members. Eager to prove himself, Wayne began monitoring those of us working on the hoods. He caught me waiting for parts to finish processing not once, but 3 times in a span of 2 weeks. This observation led him to assertively remind me to stay active and not to wait around. I simply nodded in agreement. As he observed, I began inserting A parts while B parts were still in the cycle. This caused immediate errors. I waited for the skilled trades team to address the issue. A few minutes later, I resumed work, only to encounter more errors. When the skilled trades team returned and inquired about the issue, I pointed to Wayne. Wayne asked, "Did you know it was going to malfunction?" I replied, "I was just following your instructions." Part 2. Wayne remained my manager and seemed to have learned little from past experiences. He decided that due to a previous shortage of A hoods, he needed to have more control over when workers switched between A and B hoods. This shortage had occurred because a new team member was still learning the ropes and had caused a brief halt in the production line by switching too late. Some workers preferred producing large batches of either A or B hoods instead of switching frequently. Wayne instructed us not to switch unless he or the team leader gave the go-ahead. I complied and continued producing A parts. It must have been a hectic day because neither Wayne nor the team leader checked in for hours. A driver approached me to inquire if I would be producing B parts soon. I relayed Wayne's instructions to her. She responded, "Well, I'm running out of racks, but whatever." She had been with the company for a while and was used to such situations. Eventually, Wayne hurriedly returned, instructing me to switch to B hoods. Unfortunately, his timing was off. The production line had run out of B hoods and empty racks. The robots were also filled with A hoods. Without any empty racks, the line couldn't progress, and I couldn't produce B hoods because the robots were occupied. This resulted in a 20-minute halt in production. Afterward, we were advised to use our best judgment in future situations. I simply nodded and resumed my usual tasks. The next one is an entitled people story. A couple of months ago, we put up a private driveway do not enter sign. The 13-year-old kid next door mocked it daily. We caught him on our Ring camera and saw him doing it as well. Then one night, the private driveway sign disappeared, coincidentally around the time the kid was hanging around near the sign. The Ring camera didn't capture him moving the sign, but it was more than likely him. I had spoken to him and his mother in the past, asking the kids to stay on their own property. My requests were ignored. Now, whenever we get a delivery, he's outside, saying in a snotty tone, "Private driveway, keep out!" He's done this to utility workers, delivery people, and pretty much anyone who temporarily parks in our driveway, including our guests. I assume he thinks that because we allow delivery people and our guests to use our driveway, he can use it too. I'm not going to ask him again to stay off my property. I don't want to deal with that situation. I've already spoken to both the mother and the kid, and the behavior continues. We're installing a fence between our properties, and it can't be installed soon enough. It feels like we've been waiting forever for the parts to arrive, let alone schedule the installation. I'm considering having an attorney send a letter, but I'm concerned the kid will tamper with the survey property markers before the fence is erected. Honestly, I'm surprised he hasn't tampered with those markers already. He tried moving the old ones in the backyard more than once. That's why we had new ones installed. The flagged markers are easy to remove. There's rebar the surveyor pounded into the ground, but the flagged markers are there to guide the fencing installer. When I spoke to the mother about the situation, she simply said she'd talk to her son, but kids will be kids. I disagree. This isn't what a well-behaved kid does. This is the behavior of a disrespectful kid who doesn't understand boundaries. I've taken precautions. We have security cameras in case of retaliation. However, security cameras don't capture everything. They didn't record who removed the driveway sign. I don't want to spend more on high-tech security cameras. Where does it end? Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.